religious strife and political ambition. For nearly a decade, Catholic forces had relentlessly pressed forward, leaving the Protestant cause teetering on the brink of collapse. Victory after victory had emboldened the Catholic League, and for those clinging to the hope of religious freedom, it seemed the light was dimming fast. The 30 Years' War had already consumed so much, leaving the continent fractured and in ruins. But just when the Protestants appeared all but defeated, a beacon of hope arrived from the cold north. His name was Gustavus Adolphus, and with him came a military revolution that would reshape the course of the war. Before we dive into the thrilling Swedish phase of the conflict, it's essential to remember where we've been. In earlier episodes, we witnessed the early triumphs of the Catholic League, led by General Tilly and Wallenstein, crushing Protestant forces across the Holy Roman Empire. The Protestant cause, fragmented and lacking unity, seemed destined for disaster. Their hopes were dashed repeatedly at battles like White Mountain and Dessau Bridge, leaving much of Central Europe in the grip of the Catholic League's iron fist. Protestant princes bowed under the weight of oppression, and religious freedom appeared to be slipping through their fingers. But history has a way of turning tides when least expected. The Swedish intervention, led by Gustavus Adolphus, would prove to be just that, a monumental shift in the war's momentum. Known as the Lion of the North, Gustavus was more than just a king. He was a tactician of unmatched brilliance. His entry into the war marked not just another phase of the conflict, but a complete transformation of the battlefield. Sweden's involvement wasn't just a show of force, it was a demonstration of cutting-edge military innovation, bold strategy, and a renewed sense of hope for the Protestant forces. Now, as we begin this episode, we'll be taking a deep dive into this pivotal chapter of the war. We'll explore how Gustavus Adolphus and his Swedish forces arrived at just the right moment to stem the Catholic tide. We'll relive the monumental Battle of Breitenfeld, a victory that shocked the Catholic League, and trace the steps to the tragic yet heroic end at the Battle of Lutzen. Gustavus Adolphus may have fallen in battle, but his legacy and the momentum he brought to the Protestant cause lived on, shaping the geopolitical landscape of Europe for decades to come. Welcome to ASMR History, where today we unravel one of the most defining moments of the 30 Years' War, the Swedish intervention under Gustavus Adolphus. Through this exploration, we'll witness how one man's vision and courage breathed life back into a dying cause and shifted the balance of power across Europe. If you're a fan of history's great turning points, this episode promises to captivate and inspire. But to truly understand the significance of Gustavus Adolphus's victories, we must first examine the bold decision that brought him into the war. His entry wasn't just a reaction to events, it was a calculated move that would redefine the fate of Europe. When Gustavus Adolphus looked across the war-torn landscape of Europe in the early 1630s, he saw more than just destruction. He saw a continent teetering on the edge of total Catholic domination, the Protestant cause hanging by a thread. For over a decade, the Catholic Habsburgs had crushed Protestant forces underfoot, extending their influence and tightening their grip across the Holy Roman Empire. For Gustavus, this wasn't just a distant conflict, it was a looming threat to everything he held dear: the survival of Protestantism, the stability of Northern Europe, and Sweden's growing ambitions as a regional power. Sweden's entry into the 30 Years' War wasn't inevitable, but it became necessary as the Habsburgs' ambitions continued to expand. Politically, the rise of Habsburg power posed a direct threat to Sweden's influence, especially over the critical Baltic region. The control of the Baltic Sea was not only an economic lifeline for Sweden, providing vital trade routes, but it was also key to maintaining its security. As the Habsburgs pushed further into Northern Europe, Gustavus saw a future where Sweden could be isolated, its Protestant allies crushed, and its influence diminished to the margins of European politics. But religious concerns weighed just as heavily on the king's mind. Gustavus viewed himself as a defender of the Protestant faith, not just for Sweden, but for all of Europe. The very existence of Protestantism was at stake, and in Gustavus's eyes, the time for waiting was over. By 1630, the geopolitical situation in Northern Europe was volatile, and Sweden stood at a crossroads. The Catholic forces, led by the formidable Habsburg dynasty, had stretched their influence far beyond the empire's traditional borders. The Treaty of Lubeck in 1629 had already forced Denmark, another Protestant power, to withdraw from the conflict. With Denmark out, Gustavus knew that Sweden was next in line. If Sweden did not act, it risked being surrounded by Catholic powers, hostile to both its faith and its sovereignty. But more than just survival was at play. Gustavus harboured a grander vision. He sought to position Sweden as the preeminent Protestant power in Europe, a protector of religious freedom, and a counterweight to the mighty Habsburgs. As Gustavus prepared to lead his nation into one of Europe's most devastating conflicts, his leadership qualities began to shine. He was a man of sharp intellect, bold strategy, and unwavering conviction. Unlike many monarchs of his time, Gustavus was not content to rule from afar. He led from the front, standing shoulder to shoulder with his soldiers, earning their respect and loyalty. His vision for Sweden extended beyond its borders. He saw it as a beacon of Protestant strength, a nation destined to play a decisive role in Europe's future. But it wasn't just vision that set Gustavus apart. It was his revolutionary approach to warfare. I bring a new kind of warfare to the fields of Europe, Gustavus once proclaimed. This was no idle boast. The Swedish army under Gustavus Adolphus was unlike anything Europe had seen before. Where other armies clung to outdated tactics, relying on massive, slow-moving infantry blocks and static artillery positions, Gustavus brought innovation and precision to the battlefield. He had studied the failures of other Protestant forces and knew that brute force alone could not win this war. Instead, he focused on mobility, discipline, and a highly coordinated approach that would soon give Sweden a fearsome reputation. The Swedish army was a well-oiled machine, known for its discipline and training, but it was their tactics that truly set them apart. Gustavus pioneered the use of combined arms, where different types of units, infantry, cavalry, and artillery, worked together in perfect harmony. This was a stark contrast to the traditional European armies that tended to use their forces in isolation. Swedish infantry moved in flexible formations, allowing them to adapt to changing battlefield conditions. Meanwhile, cavalry units were not just used for charges, but were integrated into the flow of battle, providing support to both infantry and artillery. One of Gustavus's most groundbreaking innovations was his use of mobile artillery. While other armies treated their cannons as stationary behemoths to be positioned at the start of a battle and left there, Gustavus saw the potential for a more dynamic approach. His cannons were lighter, more mobile, and could be repositioned as needed, allowing his forces to adapt to the ebb and flow of combat in real time. This ability to move artillery quickly gave the Swedish army a tactical edge, allowing them to deliver devastating firepower at critical moments. Gustavus also recognized the importance of morale and leadership. He believed that his soldiers should be motivated by more than just fear or duty. They needed to believe in the cause they were fighting for. To that end, Gustavus fostered a sense of shared purpose within his ranks. His men fought not just for their king, but for their faith and their homeland. This sense of unity and conviction would prove crucial in the battles to come, where the odds were often stacked against them. When Gustavus finally decided to enter the war, it was with a clear sense of purpose. In June 1630, his forces landed on the northern coast of Germany, marking the beginning of Sweden's direct involvement in the 30 Years' War. Gustavus didn't come as an invader seeking territory, at least not at first. He presented himself as a liberator, here to save the Protestant cause from annihilation. His arrival was a lifeline for the Protestant princes, many of whom had lost hope of ever turning the tide against the Catholic League. But while his rhetoric spoke of religious freedom, there were undeniable political motivations behind Sweden's intervention. Gustavus knew that to protect Sweden's interests, he needed to weaken the Habsburgs and prevent them from dominating northern Europe. At first, the situation looked bleak for Gustavus. His forces were relatively small, and the Catholic armies, under the command of seasoned generals like Count Tilly, had become overconfident after years of unchecked victories. But what Gustavus lacked in numbers, he more than made up for in strategy and discipline. His army was lean, efficient, and ready for a fight. The Protestant cause, which had been floundering for years, suddenly had a powerful and capable ally on its side. The initial months of Sweden's involvement were marked by a cautious build-up, as Gustavus sought to rally support from the remaining Protestant princes and solidify his foothold in northern Germany. But the Catholic forces were quick to take notice, Gustavus had come to disrupt the status quo, and they were not about to let him do so without a fight. The clash that would follow would mark one of the most important turning points in the entire war, the Battle of Breitenfeld. This battle, fought in 1631, would be Gustavus' first true test on the continental stage. It was here that the full might of his tactical genius would be put to the test against the seasoned forces of the Catholic League. Breitenfeld was more than just a battlefield. It was a proving ground for the new kind of warfare Gustavus had promised. The world would soon see just how revolutionary his methods were, and the fate of the Protestant cause hung in the balance. The morning of September the 17th, 1631, dawned cold and grey as two great armies squared off on the plains outside Breitenfeld. On one side stood the forces of the Catholic League, led by the renowned Count Tilly, confident after a decade of victories. His troops, hardened by battle and loyal to the Habsburg cause, had crushed nearly every Protestant army they'd faced, and there was little reason to believe this day would be any different. On the other side stood the Swedish army, led by Gustavus Adolphus, the Lion of the North, and their allies, the Saxons. For the first time in years, the Protestant forces had hope. Breitenfeld would become a crucible, a test of tactics, innovation, and leadership. What unfolded on that battlefield would change the course of the 30 Years' War forever. Gustavus Adolphus had not come to Breitenfeld alone. His careful diplomacy had brought him alliances with the Protestant princes of northern Germany, most notably the Elector of Saxony, whose forces would fight alongside the Swedes. For the Protestant princes, aligning with Sweden was their last desperate chance to resist the Catholic steamroller. Tilly's forces had swept through Germany, laying waste to any who stood in their way. With Denmark driven from the war, Protestant Europe looked to Gustavus as their saviour. But for all the hope pinned on the Swedish king, the situation remained perilous. Count Tilly commanded a massive, well-trained army, and his men had been victorious too many times to fear a foreign invader, no matter how bold. As the two armies prepared for battle, it was clear that this clash would be a defining moment. Breitenfeld wasn't just another battle, it was a confrontation between two radically different approaches to warfare. Tilly's forces followed the traditional European model, heavy blocks of infantry supported by slow, ponderous artillery. These rigid formations had served him well in the past, but on the wide, open plains of Breitenfeld, they would prove to be his downfall. Gustavus, on the other hand, had revolutionized the art of war. His army was lean, disciplined, and incredibly mobile. He brought a new kind of warfare to Europe, one built on speed, flexibility, and devastating firepower. His innovations would be tested here like never before. At the heart of Gustavus's strategy was his use of combined arms, a tactic that blended infantry, cavalry, and artillery into a coordinated whole. Where Tilly's artillery was slow and cumbersome, Gustavus had developed lighter, mobile cannons that could be repositioned during the battle, providing constant support to to his advancing troops. His infantry formations were more flexible, capable of quick manoeuvres that allowed them to adapt to the changing conditions of the battlefield. Unlike the rigid, unwieldy blocks of Tilly's forces, the Swedish soldiers could spread out, regroup, and strike where the enemy was weakest. As the battle began, Tilly made the first move, launching a massive assault on the Saxon forces positioned on the left flank. Within hours, the Saxons were in full retreat, and it seemed as if the Catholic forces would once again steamroll their Protestant opponents. But Gustavus did not panic. Instead, he executed one of the most brilliant tactical manoeuvres of the war. Rather than crumbling alongside the fleeing Saxons, Gustavus swiftly shifted his forces to fill the gap, repositioning his troops to counter Tilly's advance. It was a bold move that required both precision and discipline, and it worked. The Swedish forces held firm, and the battle continued. Gustavus's artillery played a critical role in the day's events. Unlike Tilly's stationary cannons, which could only fire from fixed positions, Gustavus's mobile artillery units pounded the Catholic lines with deadly accuracy, wearing them down with sustained fire. This constant bombardment kept Tilly's forces off balance, preventing them from launching a coordinated assault. Every time the Catholic troops tried to press their advantage, they were met with a barrage of cannon fire, followed by a quick counterattack from Gustavus' infantry and cavalry. The turning point of the battle came when Tilly, frustrated by his inability to break the Swedish lines, ordered a full-scale frontal assault. It was a costly mistake. Gustavus had anticipated the move and had set a trap. As the Catholic forces surged forward, the Swedish infantry fell back in a controlled retreat, drawing Tilly's men into a vulnerable position. At that moment, Gustavus unleashed his cavalry, flanking the Catholic forces and striking them from the sides. Trapped between the Swedish cavalry and the relentless artillery fire, Tilly's army began to crumble. What had started as an aggressive offensive quickly turned into a desperate fight for survival. By late afternoon, the Catholic army was in disarray. Tilly's forces, which had been so dominant at the start of the day, were now retreating in chaos. The battlefield was littered with the dead and dying, and the once unbeatable Catholic League had been decisively beaten. It was the first major Protestant victory of the war, and it sent shockwaves through Europe. Breitenfeld wasn't just a battle, it was a signal to the world that the Protestant cause had a champion. As historian Peter H. Wilson put it, Breitenfeld was not just a battle, it was a signal to the world that the Protestant cause had a champion. The victory at Breitenfeld had far-reaching consequences. For the first time in years, the Protestants had halted the Catholic advance, and the balance of power in Europe had begun to shift. Gustavus Adolphus had proven himself to be not only a master strategist, but a true leader of men, capable of turning the tide of war in favour of the Protestants. His victory revitalised the Protestant cause, giving hope to those who had been on the verge of surrender. The impact of Breitenfeld rippled across the continent, inspiring other Protestant states to join the fight and challenging the Catholic League's dominance. But while Breitenfeld was a triumph, it was Gustavus knew that the war was far from over, and that one victory, no matter how decisive, would not be enough to secure the future of Protestantism in Europe. The Catholic League, though shaken, was not defeated. Tilly would regroup, and the Habsburgs would not take this humiliation lightly. More battles awaited, and Gustavus would soon find himself in the thick of the fighting once again. For now, though, the victory at Breitenfeld stood as a testament to Gustavus's leadership, his vision, and his willingness to defy the odds. The Protestant forces had found their champion, and Europe had found a new kind of warfare. The Swedish king had brought discipline, innovation, and hope to a war that had seemed hopeless. His tactics would be studied for generations to come, and his legacy was already being written on the battlefield. But as Gustavus marched his army deeper into the heart of Europe, destiny had one more twist in store for him. The Lion of the North had roared at Breitenfeld, but his final act was yet to come. On the plains of Lutzen, amid the fog and gunfire, Gustavus would meet his fate in one of the war's most tragic and heroic moments. The fog rolled across the plains of Lutzen, thick and unrelenting, shrouding the armies in an eerie, suffocating silence. It was November 16th, 1632, and the fate of Europe was once again hanging in the balance. Gustavus Adolphus, the Lion of the North, stood ready to lead his troops into battle against one of his most formidable enemies yet, Albrecht von Wallenstein. After the triumph at Breitenfeld, Gustavus's reputation as a military genius had grown, and the Protestant cause had been reinvigorated. But Wallenstein, recalled by Emperor Ferdinand to command the Catholic forces, was not a man to be underestimated. With his cunning and ruthlessness, he was determined to crush the Swedish king and turn the tide of the war. The tension leading up to Lutzen had been simmering for months. Wallenstein had begun to march his forces across Saxony, threatening the gains that Gustavus had made in the past year. Gustavus, sensing the urgency, mobilized his army to confront the Catholic forces head-on. The battle would take place under some of the most challenging conditions imaginable. The fog clung to the ground, obscuring vision, while the cold November wind bit at the soldiers. For hours, the two armies stood facing each other, unable to see clearly through the mist. The battlefield was a treacherous maze of uncertainty, where any wrong move could lead to disaster. Yet, despite the weather and the hazards it presented, both commanders were determined to engage. As the battle began, chaos quickly erupted. The fog made it nearly impossible for either side to maintain formation, and communication between units became a nightmare. Orders were shouted into the haze, sometimes lost in the clamour of battle, as troops stumbled forward, often unsure of their direction. For Gustavus Adolphus, this was a particular challenge. His tactical brilliance relied on mobility and precision, qualities that the weather had rendered almost useless. Still, the Swedish king pressed on, determined to break Wallenstein's lines. His mobile artillery, so effective in previous engagements, struggled to find targets in the fog, but Gustavus refused to be deterred. rally his troops and inspire them with his presence. But the fog that blanketed the battlefield also masked danger. Separated from his bodyguards, Gustavus suddenly found himself vulnerable, exposed to the enemy. In the confusion, he was struck by enemy fire. A bullet tore through his arm, and another hit his back, knocking him from his horse. Amid the chaos, few realized what had happened at first. His horse galloped riderless across the battlefield, a silent herald of the tragedy that had just unfolded. Gustavus, mortally wounded, was surrounded by enemy cavalry. His lifeless body was soon discovered by his devastated soldiers. The king, the Lion of the North, was dead. In an instant, the heart of the Swedish army was ripped out. A wave of disbelief and grief swept through the ranks. "Our king is gone, but his cause will not die with him," one Swedish officer reportedly said, his voice heavy with both sorrow and resolve. The death of Gustavus Adolphus could have been the breaking point for the Protestant forces. His men, shocked and leaderless, might have easily fallen apart, retreating in despair. But something remarkable happened. Instead of crumbling, the Swedish army fought with renewed fury, their king's death igniting a fierce determination to win the day. Gustavus had inspired his soldiers not just with his leadership, but with his vision for the Protestant cause. Even in his absence, they carried his ideals into battle. The fighting at Lutzen was savage, and both sides suffered heavy casualties, but by the end of the day, the Protestants had managed to drive Wallenstein's forces from the field. It was a victory, one paid for with the life of their beloved king. The immediate consequences of Gustavus's death were profound. For Sweden, it was a devastating blow. Gustavus Adolphus had not just been the heart of their military strategy, he was the embodiment of Sweden's aspirations on the European stage. His death created a vacuum that could not easily be filled. The Protestant cause, which had been revitalized by his leadership, suddenly found itself without its greatest champion. His daughter Christina, only 6 years old at the time, would inherit the throne, but it was his generals and advisors who would bear the burden of continuing the war. Yet, even as the Protestant forces mourned the loss of their king, the legacy of Gustavus Adolphus endured. He had fundamentally changed the nature of warfare in Europe, bringing innovative tactics that would influence military strategy for generations to come. His use of mobile artillery, combined arms, and flexible formations had proven devastatingly effective against the rigid, outdated tactics of the Catholic forces. Though Gustavus was gone, his army remained a potent force, and the principles he had instilled in his men did not die with him. On the broader scale of the war, the death of Gustavus Adolphus was both a tragedy and a turning point. In the short term, it left the Protestant cause in a precarious position. Wallenstein, though beaten at Lutzen, was not out of the fight, and the Catholic forces remained a significant threat. But in the long term, Gustavus' influence would continue to shape the course of the war. His victories at Breitenfeld and Lutzen had shown that the Catholic forces could be beaten, and his presence in the war had drawn in new Protestant allies, ensuring that the fight would go on. Swedish phase of the 30 Years' War had begun with his entry, but his impact would be felt long after his death. As we reflect on the legacy of Gustavus Adolphus, it is clear that he was more than just a warrior king. He was a visionary who saw the potential for a new kind of Europe, one where Protestant states could stand on equal footing with their Catholic rivals. His leadership had not only changed the course of a war, but had altered the balance of power across the continent. His death was a blow, but it was not the end of the Protestant cause. The torch he had lit would be carried forward by those who believed in his vision, even in the face of overwhelming odds. The battle at Lutzen was the end of Gustavus Adolphus' journey, but it was not the end of his influence. His death marked a turning point in the 30 Years' War, as the conflict entered a new and uncertain phase. Now, the question was no longer whether Sweden could tip the scales, but how his legacy would continue to shape the war and the future of Europe. In the next phase of the war, the impact of the Swedish intervention would be fully realised, as Protestant forces, fueled by Gustavus' legacy, sought to secure the victories he had fought so hard to achieve. The 30 Years' War had raged across Europe for over a decade, leaving devastation and despair in its wake. Protestant forces had suffered crushing defeats, and the Catholic Habsburgs seemed unstoppable, their power and influence stretching from the heart of the Holy Roman Empire to the far reaches of Europe. But when Sweden, under the leadership of Gustavus Adolphus, entered the fray, everything changed. The Swedish phase of the war marked a pivotal moment, one that would not only alter the course of the conflict, but also reshape the future of European politics and warfare. Sweden's involvement revitalised a Protestant cause that had been all but written off. The early Catholic victories had created a sense of inevitability, as if the Habsburgs' dominance would continue unchecked. Yet, when Gustavus Adolphus marched into Germany with his disciplined and innovative army, that perception crumbled. His victories, especially at Breitenfeld and Lutzen, were nothing short of revolutionary. For the first time in years, the Protestant forces were not just surviving, they were winning. Gustavus's brilliant use of mobile artillery and combined arms tactics allowed his troops to outmaneuver and outfight the rigid Catholic forces, proving that the Habsburgs were not invincible. As historian C.V. Wedgwood aptly puts it, Sweden's victories shattered the myth of Habsburg invincibility. Gustavus's military successes didn't just inspire hope, they sparked a renewed belief in the Protestant cause. Protestant princes, who had previously been reluctant to rise up against the Catholic League, now saw that the fight was not over. With Sweden leading the charge, it became clear that the Habsburgs could be defeated, and Protestant states across Europe rallied to continue the struggle. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about reclaiming lost ground and reasserting their place in Europe. The victory at Breitenfeld in 1631 was the turning point that gave Protestant forces the momentum they desperately needed. Before Breitenfeld, the Protestant armies had been on the defensive, often outgunned and outmaneuvered by the Catholic League. Gustavus Gustavus Adolphus changed all that. His army, with its innovative tactics and disciplined soldiers, crushed the Catholic forces in a battle that shocked Europe. Breitenfeld wasn't just a battlefield victory, it was a symbolic triumph that proved the Protestants could fight back. This victory inspired Protestant states like Saxony and Brandenburg to join forces with Sweden, swelling the ranks of those who were willing to oppose the Catholic hegemony. The shockwaves of Sweden's victories reached far beyond the battlefield. Politically, the balance of power in Europe began to shift. Before Sweden's intervention, the Habsburgs had been poised to dominate much of the continent. Their control over the Holy Roman Empire seemed unshakable, and their influence was spreading rapidly. But Gustavus Adolphus's campaigns forced them to reconsider their ambitions. The Habsburgs, once the towering giants of European politics, now faced a serious challenge. Sweden had not only altered the course of the war, but had also emerged as a major power in its own right. Sweden's rise was one of the most unexpected consequences of the 30 Years' War. Before the conflict, Sweden had been a relatively small regional power, focused mainly on securing its influence around the Baltic Sea. But Gustavus Adolphus' military genius and his vision for Sweden's role in Europe propelled the country onto the world stage. Sweden's military successes brought it respect and influence, and the nation quickly became one of the key players in European politics. Gustavus's death in 1632 at Lutzen may have robbed Sweden of its charismatic leader, but his legacy endured. The Swedish army continued to fight with the same discipline and effectiveness, ensuring that Sweden's newfound power did not fade. The broader geopolitical implications of the Swedish phase of the war were immense. Sweden's victories forced other European powers to reconsider their strategies and alliances. France, under Cardinal Richelieu, had been watching the war with great interest. Though Catholic, France had no desire to see the Habsburgs dominate Europe. Sweden's involvement gave France an opportunity to intervene more directly, aligning itself with the Protestant cause to weaken the Habsburgs. This new alignment reshaped the alliances of the war and added even more complexity to the conflict, drawing more nations into the struggle. The Swedish phase also had a profound impact on the way wars were fought. Gustavus Adolphus' innovations in battlefield tactics, his use of mobile artillery, the integration of cavalry, infantry, and artillery into a cohesive force, and his emphasis on discipline and mobility became models for armies across Europe. His influence on military strategy was felt long after his death, and his reforms laid the groundwork for modern warfare. The rigid, lumbering formations of the past gave way to more fluid and adaptable strategies, forever changing how battles would be fought. While Gustavus's death at Lutzen in 1632 was a devastating blow, it did not bring an end to Sweden's influence in the war. His army continued to operate under capable commanders, and the momentum he had created carried the Protestant forces through several more years of the conflict. Sweden remained a key player in the 30 Years' War, its presence a constant resilience, determination, and innovation, qualities that would inspire generations of military leaders to come. Yet, the war was far from over. Sweden's victories, though significant, had not yet brought peace to Europe. The conflict raged on, dragging more and more countries into its web of alliances, betrayals, and battles. The Protestant forces had gained ground, but the Catholic League remained a powerful foe. In the next phase of the war, new political manoeuvrings and military campaigns would shape the final outcome. As the war entered a new phase, the need for resolution became more urgent. The devastating toll on Europe's population, economies, and landscapes was becoming too great to ignore. It was in this context that the negotiations leading to the Peace of Prague would begin to take shape. But the lessons of the Swedish phase were clear. The Habsburgs' dominance had been broken, and the future of Europe would not be decided by force alone. Diplomacy, once again, would rise to the forefront of the war's final chapters. The Peace of Prague, signed in May 1635, was supposed to be the turning point that would end decades of bloodshed, ruin, and chaos. After years of religious and political conflict between Catholic and Protestant forces within the Holy Roman Empire, this treaty aimed to bring reconciliation. Emperor Ferdinand II, recognizing the unsustainable devastation across his territories, sought a compromise with the Protestant states. The treaty offered a path to peace by promising religious concessions to the Protestant princes, restoring their properties and rights in exchange for their allegiance to the empire. It was a diplomatic attempt to heal the deep rift between the Catholic and Protestant factions that had torn the empire apart for over a decade. At first glance, the Peace of Prague seemed like a glimmer of hope. It allowed Protestant states to maintain their religious practices, easing the rigid terms of the Edict of Restitution, which had demanded the return of all church lands seized by Protestants since 1552. The treaty also sought to end the influence of foreign powers in the conflict, encouraging Protestant princes to reconcile with the Catholic Emperor and unify under the Holy Roman Empire's banner. Wallenstein, the Emperor's key military commander, had fallen, and the idea of a German peace began to take hold. It was, on the surface, a chance to end the war that had consumed much of Europe. But peace would not come so easily. While many Protestant princes within the empire accepted the treaty, the external forces that had become entangled in the conflict were not so willing to stand down. Sweden, having carved out a position of power and influence through Gustavus Adolphus' victories, refused to accept the terms of the Peace of Prague. Sweden's interest in the war had gone far beyond religious matters. They were now a major power in Europe, and they were not about to give up their hard-won influence. Similarly, France, under the guidance of Cardinal Richelieu, had entered the war not out of religious loyalty, but out of political ambition. France saw the continued weakening of the Habsburgs as essential to its own rise in European politics. This refusal by external powers to recognise the Peace of Prague was the treaty's undoing. Though the internal conflict within the Holy Roman Empire always set on weakening the Habsburgs and expanding their own spheres of influence. The Peace of Prague, which might have ended the war if it had been reached earlier, was too little, too late. It could not undo the entangled web of alliances and ambitions that had grown far beyond the empire's borders. The failure of the Peace of Prague had profound implications. By failing to bring an end to the war, it prolonged the suffering and devastation that had already ravaged Europe. Entire regions were left depopulated, towns and cities destroyed, and economies shattered. The continued fighting dragged other powers deeper into the conflict, pulling Europe further into a spiral of destruction. For the Holy Roman Empire, the treaty's collapse also represented a missed opportunity to restore unity and order within its own fractured borders. The division between Catholic and Protestant princes may have been momentarily patched up, but the empire's power was increasingly undermined by external influences that cared little for reconciliation. In the broader context of the 30 Years' War, the Peace of Prague marked the end of any hope that the war could be contained within the empire. The conflict was no longer just a German civil war. It had become a continental struggle for power. The involvement of France and Sweden ensured that the war would continue, and the religious divisions that had once driven the conflict were now overshadowed by the political ambitions of Europe's great powers. The dream of a German peace was dead, replaced by the reality of a war that seemed to have no end. As the war entered its final phases, the devastation only grew. The Peace of Prague had been a brief pause, but it did not bring the lasting resolution that so many had hoped for. With France and Sweden continuing to press their advantage, the war would rage on for more than another decade, reshaping the map of Europe and leaving a legacy of destruction that would be felt for generations to come. Despite the failure of the Peace of Prague, it served as a reminder that diplomacy, even in the midst of war, was not entirely dead. Negotiations continued in various forms throughout the conflict, and by the time the war did finally end in 1648 with the Peace of Westphalia, the lessons of Prague had not been forgotten. The war had shown that force alone could not resolve Europe's deep-seated religious and political divisions, and that true peace would require compromise on a much grander scale. In the next episode, we will explore how the war dragged on through these final brutal years, with France and Sweden becoming the dominant players in a conflict that was once about religion but had transformed into a battle for control of Europe. The Peace of Prague may have failed, but it set the stage for the ultimate resolution of the 30 Years' War. As exhausted powers finally began to realise that there was no victor in a war of such unimaginable destruction, the Swedish phase of the 30 Years' War was nothing short of transformative. When Gustavus Adolphus entered the war, he brought with him not only a powerful army, but a new way of fighting. His military genius reshaped the battlefield, introducing tactics and strategies that left his enemies scrambling. Victories like Breitenfeld and Lutzen shattered the illusion of Habsburg invincibility and reignited hope for the Protestant cause across Europe. Under Gustavus's leadership, Sweden emerged from the shadows of Northern Europe and established itself His entry into the war gave the Protestants a chance to strike back after years of crushing defeats. But, as we've seen, Gustavus' death at Lutzen in 1632 was a turning point. While his army fought on, his loss was a devastating blow to the Protestant forces. His vision and leadership had driven their resurgence, and without him, the Protestants found themselves struggling to maintain their momentum. Sweden remained a force to be reckoned with, but the war was far from over. The Protestant cause, though shaken, still had fight left in it, and the conflict dragged on, now shifting toward the involvement of other powerful players. As the war entered its next phase, external forces, particularly France, began to take centre stage. No longer was this just a war of religion between Catholic and Protestant forces. It had evolved into a geopolitical struggle for dominance. France, under the direction of Cardinal Richelieu, sought to weaken the Habsburgs and expand its own influence, and this would drive the conflict into its final, brutal phase. In our next episode, we'll explore this transition, focusing on France's intervention and the shifting alliances that would define the war's closing chapters. We'll see how the ambitions of kings and cardinals transformed what had once been a German civil war into a truly continental conflict. The 30 Years' War was far from over, and the devastation that would follow would reshape Europe for generations. As we close the chapter on the Swedish phase, it's impossible to overlook the legacy of Gustavus Adolphus. His impact went far beyond the battlefield. He altered the balance of power in Europe, demonstrating that a smaller nation could challenge even the mightiest of empires. His military innovations influenced warfare for centuries, and his dedication to the Protestant cause helped ensure that religious freedom would not be snuffed out. Though he did not live to see the end of the war, his influence endured, and his legacy continues to echo through the pages of European history. Thank you for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and, as always, sleep well